All right, hello everyone. We've got about 1 minute until go time. Please pop in the chat. I just fixed it, so now you can tell us where you are tuning in from. We are super excited to celebrate 235 years of We the People today. It is Constitution Day, so we are doing it big with celebrations all day long. But I'm very excited for this program. We are going to welcome Dr. Stuart Leibiger of Salle University, who is here to talk to us more about what happened during that summer of 1787. So without further ado, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Leibiger.
35th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution, and we're so excited that you are able to join us here at the nation's most historic square mile. And for our virtual audience members, thank you for tuning in for our conversation today. As we celebrate the anniversary of the Constitution, we're excited to go back in time to that summer of 1787 and learn about the key historic figures, key debates, key compromises, the atmosphere surrounding the Constitutional Convention. And we have a wonderful scholar today who's going to be talking to us about that. And it's my pleasure to introduce a great historian of the Constitutional Convention and my favorite professor from graduate school, Dr. Stuart Leibiger of Salle University. So Dr. Leibiger, thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you to talk to us about the Constitutional Convention.
Thank you, Kevin. Kevin was one of the star students in our MA program at Salle University. Good afternoon, everybody. Today we'll take about 30 minutes or so, and we'll look at the Constitutional Convention, and we'll begin with some Constitutional Convention fun facts. So here's Independence Hall today, but this is how Independence Hall looked during the time of the Constitutional Convention. Do you notice a major structural difference in the building? No tower. The original tower, which was built in the 1730s, had become dilapidated and had to be taken down. And so there was no tower at the time of the Constitutional Convention. The tower that you see there today was built in the 1820s. Okay, next fun fact, how did Independence Hall get its name? It was not called Independence Hall at the time of the Constitutional Convention. It was called the Pennsylvania State House because it was the Capitol building for the state of Pennsylvania. Doesn't get the name Independence Hall until 1824. In 1824, a Frenchman named the Marquis de Lafayette, who had helped us win our independence on the battlefield, Lafayette returned back to Philadelphia in 1824. And he went to see the building, and by then it was so dilapidated and falling apart, Lafayette was stunned. And Lafayette exclaimed, "Philadelphia, what has happened to your Hall of Independence?" And so the name Independence Hall is born and the building is saved. All right, next fun fact. Everybody knows what was the weather like during the summer of 1787 during the Constitutional Convention. What was the weather like? Hot and humid. Painfully so. The hot weather has become the stuff of legend. In fact, though, the hot weather is kind of a myth. Fact, the temperature that summer was below normal. Philadelphia enjoyed a cool summer in 1787 with temperatures below average. The month of July, 4 degrees below normal. Now, of course, even a cool summer in Philadelphia can still seem painfully uncomfortable, especially if it's humid, and we don't know what the humidity was. And things will be especially uncomfortable if you're meeting in a sealed room without any ventilation. So the stories of hot weather are not necessarily false, but they are overblown. Fourth fun fact, Philadelphia was the biggest metropolis in the United States at the time of the Constitutional Convention, with a population of 40,000 people. It was a center of culture, art, commerce, and diversity. So you would think the delegates to the convention would be thrilled to be meeting in such an exciting and fascinating city, right? Well, wrong. Believe it or not, many of the delegates hated being in Philadelphia. Let me give you a couple examples. George Mason of Virginia wrote, quote, I grow heartily tired of the etiquette and nonsense so fashionable in this city. Mason wrote that on the third day of the convention. He's already sick of Philadelphia. Another example would be John Langdon of New Hampshire, who wrote, quote, "Notwithstanding the riches and splendor of this city, the fatiguing sameness makes me sick." And just one more example, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, he compared Philadelphians, quote, "to monks and nuns cloistered in a monastery." One delegate, though, who absolutely loved being in Philadelphia was George Washington. Washington spent 127 days in Philadelphia that summer, and he had just an unbelievably amazing active social life. Washington, by the way, came without Martha Washington. She stayed home at Mount Vernon. Washington went out to dinner 106 times. He went out to tea 72 times. He took 13 day trips. He attended a concert or the theater 6 times. He also sat for artists 4 times, and he went to church twice. So Washington sat for the artist Charles Wilson Peale in this painting. And what's interesting to me about this painting is what he's wearing. His Revolutionary War uniform. He brought it with him to Philadelphia. He must have been anticipating that he would be sitting for artists and portraits. Washington spent that summer as a guest in the mansion of Pennsylvania delegate Robert Morris. The building, the house, was on Market Street, and unfortunately, it no longer stands today. Believe it or not, when they were building Independence Mall in the 1950s, they knocked this building down because they didn't realize what it was. It's the same building that Washington lived in here in Philadelphia when he was president of the United States from 1790 to 1797. And so the building was knocked down essentially accidentally. And then after they knocked it down, they realized, oh no, we just knocked down the president's house. So here's the footprint of where the building was. And one of the ironies here is the enslaved people who served the household, their slave quarters sat almost exactly where what sits today, the Liberty Bell. So they knocked the building down by accident. And then to add insult to injury, they built a restroom there. But fortunately, earlier in this century, they got rid of the restroom and they built this open air museum to mark the spot. Again, this is where Washington resided when he was here for the Constitutional Convention, and then later when he was president of the United States in Philadelphia. All right, the US Constitution that we live under today is not our first national constitution. So what was our first constitution called? Articles of Confederation. And a confederation is a form of government. What is the distinguishing characteristic of a confederation? Exactly, so you do have a central government and you have state governments, but the state governments are supreme. And so in a confederation, the central government does not interact with people. The central government only interacts with the state governments, and the state governments interact with the people. And so in a confederation, the state governments are intermediaries between the central government and the people. So, for example, the Confederation Congress could not tax the people, only the states could tax the people. And then it's up to the states to give some of that money to the central government. Okay, this will lead to a huge problem that is known as free riding. What is free riding? Some states say, well, we'll enjoy the benefits of the union, but we'll let other states pay money to the central government. Okay, maybe when you go out with your friends, you have some friends who are free riders. Okay, there's the problem. By the way, this is the reason why the Confederation did not have a Bill of Rights, because the Confederation government, it did not interact with people. And so there's no need for a Bill of Rights. All right, the Constitutional Convention met from May 25th to September 17th, 1787. It met Monday through Saturday, about 5 hours a day, usually 10 to 3. Now, how many states were present at the Constitutional Convention? 12. Who wasn't there? Rhode Island was not there. But 12 states were never actually there at once. There was never more than 11 present at once, because New York left for good before New Hampshire even arrived. 55 delegates attended the convention, but only about 40 were present on any given day. And of course, they were rich white men, lawyers, planters, merchants, army officers. The ages of the delegates ranged from 26 years old to 81 years old. The youngest delegate, Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey, 26 years old, and the oldest delegate, 81 years old, was Ben Franklin. So Franklin was so old at this point that he could not walk the 2 blocks from his home to Independence Hall. And so every day he was picked up in a sedan chair like this one, and he was carried by 4 men on their shoulders. They would carry the sedan chair to Independence Hall, where Franklin would spend the day. And so the 4 guys carrying the sedan chair, they were 4 convicts from the Walnut Street prison who were out on some sort of prison release program. All right, take a look at this table, which I have in my book on the Constitutional Convention. I did not compile the table, but it is published here for the first time. It lists the delegates in the order of the number of speeches that they gave at the convention. And so you can see James Wilson gave the most speeches, 172, followed by Gouverneur Morris and James Madison. Now, keep in mind that this convention met in session for a grand total of 81 days. And so anybody who's giving more than 162 speeches is giving 2 speeches a day, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. On May 25th, the convention unanimously elected George Washington the convention president. Now, Washington was just silent during the convention. He only gave 2 speeches the whole summer, so he'd be way at the bottom of the list. And so why was Washington so quiet? Well, as convention president, he felt obligated to stay above the fray. And George Washington wasn't really an orator. That was not his strength. And so Washington says very little in debate. But he did find other ways to influence the proceedings. One of the delegates noted that all it took was a smile or a frown from Washington, and that was enough to turn the debate one way or another. Kind of like a stern look from a parent at a child can make the child obey. Now, on one occasion, Washington noticed that one of the delegates had carelessly left behind notes at the end of the day, which endangered the secrecy of the convention. And so Washington took the notes home. The next day, Washington warned the delegates. He said, quote, "I must entreat gentlemen to be more careful, lest our transactions get into the newspapers and disturb the public by premature speculations. I know not whose paper this is, but let him who owns it take it." And Washington angrily put the paper down on the table in the front, and he walked out. Nobody ever claimed those notes, okay? Because nobody wanted to be the one that Washington was reaming out. You know, you trembled in shame when Washington called you out. As far as we know, our best guess is that those notes belonged to Ben Franklin. And even Franklin was afraid to own up to it at that point. Now that story, it comes to us from a Georgia delegate named William Pierce. And so Pierce reaches into his pocket to get his notes, and his pocket is empty. And then he panics, oh no, I'm the one that Washington's reprimanding. And so he goes up to the table and he looks, it's not my notes, it's someone else's. And then he runs home and he finds his notes in his coat pocket, which he left his coat at home. One key to the convention's success is that it met in secret. The deliberations were secret. Secrecy allowed the delegates to speak freely and to change their minds. Secrecy also prevented outside forces from intervening until the whole package was complete. Most, but not all, of the delegates adhered to the secrecy rule. George Washington followed the secrecy rule so scrupulously that he would not write anything about the convention in his private diary. He wrote a note the first day, I will not write about the convention because it's secret. Now, Ben Franklin, he would entertain guests at his home under the mulberry tree outside. Here he's entertaining Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson, and James Madison. So one night, Franklin brings out this scientific specimen to show his guests. It's a two-headed snake that is preserved in a jar. And so Franklin's showing everybody this specimen. And then he says, you know, this reminds me of something that happened in the convention today. And he starts to tell this story. And then somebody says, Dr. Franklin, remember the secrecy rule. And so Franklin can't tell the story that he wanted to tell. All right, if the convention met in secret, how do we know what happened? How do we know today what happened in the convention? Madison's notes, yes. So there were actually 10 note takers among the delegates to the convention. 10 people took notes. But James Madison of Virginia is the most important note taker because he was present every day of the convention from beginning to end. Of all the surviving notes that we have, Madison took 75% of them, and the other 9 note takers combined took 25% of the notes. Madison wrote shorthand notes during the debates and then copied them out longhand as soon afterward as he could. And so here's a page of Madison's notes. Madison's notes come out to about 10 printed pages per day of the convention, which is, you know, a 700, 800 page book altogether. The secrecy rule was lifted when the convention ended. But interestingly, Madison still felt obligated not to publish his notes until all of the delegates were dead. And it just so happened that of all 55 men, Madison was the last survivor. He wasn't the youngest, but he was the last one alive. He died in 1836 at the age of 85. Madison arranged for the notes to be published posthumously after he died, and so they're not published until 1840, when every single delegate is dead. So there's the great little Madison, as his future wife, Dolly Madison, would call him. 5 feet tall, 100 pounds. One eyewitness saw Madison and exclaimed, "I never saw so much mind crammed into so little matter." All right, so why did Madison take notes? As a student of history, he was disappointed that no accounts existed of the founding of the ancient confederacies of antiquity. He wanted to spare future generations from that sort of frustration about our founding. Now, how accurate are Madison's notes? Are they a sacred, unquestionable text? Well, some have argued that Madison doctored his notes years later to make himself look better and to make others look worse. And so the accusation is that Madison actually inserted new versions of his speeches later in life to make himself look better. to make himself look less nationalistic and more anti-slavery. The problem I have with this interpretation, if Madison did doctor his notes later on, he was a pretty lousy doctor, because there's so much more he could have changed if he wanted to make himself look better. If you read the notes, Madison still comes across as very stubborn, uncompromising, a sore loser at times, and a bully at times. Yes, it is true, though, that Madison did go back and change the notes later in life. He did do that. And he probably shouldn't have done that. He probably should not have tampered with an original primary source after the fact. But he saw himself as a historian going back and reconstructing the debate, not altering it. And so he was trying to make the notes more accurate. Today, we call Madison the father of the Constitution, but his biggest contribution came not during the convention, but before the convention actually even met. Before the convention even met, Madison drafted the Virginia Plan, which became the starting draft for the Constitution. What was really significant about the Virginia Plan is that it would get rid of a confederation of states and replace it with a national government of people. Get rid of a confederation, replace it with a national government of people with the federal government supreme. The federal government does not need the states as intermediaries between it and the people. Now, I'm not going to try to do a chronological narrative of the convention. We don't have time for that. But let me take a look at 5 areas where there was a big fight at the convention and then a compromise. The biggest fight of all at the convention was the large states versus the small states. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, each state had 1 vote. Now, which states love that system? The little states love that, because that makes little Delaware just as powerful as mighty Virginia, even though Virginia has 13 times as many people. By the way, that was the method of voting in the Constitutional Convention: 1 vote, 1 state. So how many votes in the convention? 12. Okay, and so in the assembly room, there's a table for each state, and the delegates from each state decide among themselves, how will we cast our 1 vote? In the new Constitution that they're drafting, the large states want to get rid of this. And so the large states want a bicameral 2-house legislature with representation in both houses based on population. That's the essence of Madison's Virginia Plan. And the large state argument, pretty simple. We have more people, and so we should get more representatives in Congress. Why allow Delaware, with 1/13 the people of Virginia, to have as much representation as Virginia? It's not fair. But the small states want to keep a unicameral 1-house legislature in which each state will still have 1 vote. And so that is the idea put forward by William Patterson of New Jersey in the alternative plan, the New Jersey Plan. And the small state argument is also pretty simple. Every state is equally important. Every state should have an equal voice. Why allow Virginia alone, to have as much power as Georgia, New Jersey, South Carolina, Delaware, and Rhode Island combined? If we do this based on population, 1 state, Virginia, becomes as powerful as 5 other states combined. That's not fair. This fight got ugly. This was the ugliest fight of the convention, and the small states threatened to walk out over it. Now, at one point, this guy, Rufus King of Massachusetts, a big state guy, he looks right at the little states and right at Delaware especially, and he says, you know, we can do this the big state way on population, or let's just all go home right now. And let's all become separate nations. That was a threat to intimidate Delaware, because Delaware really doesn't want to be a separate nation. But Delaware was not going to be intimidated. And so one of the Delaware guys, a man named Gunning Bedford, he looks right back at Massachusetts and said, fine, let's go home right now. Delaware will become a separate nation, and Delaware will ally with a European power for protection. Okay, this is the founders' worst nightmare. The states break apart, they ally with European powers, and they go to war against each other. It got so ugly that Ben Franklin asked that a minister be brought in to pray with the delegates for a solution. Ben Franklin, the man of science and enlightenment, seeking divine intervention. Well, the big states finally gave in with the Great Compromise of July 16th, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, because it's really pushed by the delegates from Connecticut, especially Roger Sherman of Connecticut. And so today, Connecticut license plates say the Constitution State, because they pushed the Great Compromise in the convention. And so the House of Representatives is based on population, and you have state equality in the Senate, with each state getting 2 senators. The second area of conflict is this new government, is this new constitution going to be a government of people, or is it going to be a government of states? Is this new government going to be a government of people, which is what Madison wanted, or is it going to be another confederation, a government of states, which is what the New Jersey plan wanted? And of course, the answer, it will be both. This new government will be a federal government of states and people. It will be a compound republic, as Madison called it. The House of Representatives elected by the people in districts within the states, but the Senate would be elected by the state legislatures. Remember, under the original Constitution, the Senate is elected by the state legislatures. This was changed with the 17th Amendment in 1913. And so today, the people of the states elect the senators. The people of Pennsylvania will elect either Dr. Oz or John Fetterman to the Senate. And so under the original Constitution, nothing could become a law until it was passed by a majority of the people through the House of Representatives and a majority of states through the Senate. And so the states were in effect given a check on the federal government through the Senate. And so the Senate does not just protect the little states, it also protects the states, period. It protects the states as states because the legislatures would choose the senators. So really the purpose of the Senate was twofold: state equality to protect the little states, and then election by the state legislatures to protect all the states as states. All right, third area of conflict at the convention is how are you going to divide power between the federal government and the states? Where do you draw that line of federalism between the federal government and the states? Well, the Constitution specifically lists or enumerates the powers of Congress. Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the power to do this, Congress has the power to do that, and everything else belongs to the states. But the Constitution also gives the federal government some blank checks: a necessary and proper clause, a general welfare clause, a supremacy clause. And these blank checks tilt the balance of power in favor of the federal government. And so this is so different from the Articles of Confederation, which had no blank checks or no implied powers for the central government. All right, fourth fight at the Constitutional Convention is between the North and the South, especially over the slavery issue. The South wanted to count enslaved people when determining representation in Congress, arguing that enslaved people are part of the population and must be counted. And the North, of course, opposed this. The North saying, well, you Southerners, you claim that your enslaved people are property, just like cattle. Why should you get representation for your enslaved property? Your livestock does not get representation in Congress. Why should your enslaved people? And of course, the solution is what? 3/5 compromise. And so enslaved people will count as 3/5 of free people when determining representation in Congress. And so what is the logic here? What is the thinking? Well, many of the delegates to the convention felt that a legislature must not only represent people, it must also represent the property that they own. Representation should not be based just on how many people you have in your state, but on the property that they own, because property holders pay taxes. And the South argued, we have this peculiar type of property known as enslaved people that we would like to see represented. The South wanted enslaved people to count as 5/5 of people. The North wanted them to count as 0/5 of people, and so they compromise at 3/5. And then finally, the last area of conflict and compromise is, how do you balance the three branches of the federal government, executive versus legislative versus judicial? Most of the debate here was all about the presidency. What the delegates wanted to do was to create a powerful president, but not one so powerful that he can become a tyrant. And that is not an easy balance to strike. What the convention did in the end, really, if you think about it, is they went against the whole grain of the American Revolution, because they created a very powerful and independent executive, the president, in a revolution against a powerful and independent executive, the king. And so why did they do that? Well, they had a pretty good idea of who the first president was going to be. And they were quite confident that he would not abuse his power. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the presidency is designed with George Washington in mind. And here, by the way, I think is the real reason for Washington's silence during the Constitutional Convention. So much of that summer was spent designing the presidency. And it's just not appropriate for the guy who's going to hold that office someday to take the lead in designing it. He has to be silent. But it's remarkable what happens. Washington shapes the whole office of president and does it without saying a word. Now, these debates over the president, they would go in circles, because the delegates would say, well, what powers should the president have? Well, we can't decide what powers he has until we know how he's elected. So let's talk about how he's elected. Well, we can't decide how he's elected until we know how long his term's going to be. So let's talk about how long his term's going to be. We can't talk about how long his term's going to be till we know whether he can be impeached. So let's talk about whether he can be impeached. We can't talk about whether he can be impeached till we know what powers he has. And so you just went in a circle and you're right back to square one. Now, the plan for just about the whole summer, right up until the end in September, the plan was that the president will serve one 7-year term and will be elected by Congress. But the delegates were never completely happy with that, because it's not a truly independent executive, it's a creature of Congress. It's not until the last 2 weeks of the convention in September, right at the end, they take the presidency and they shove it to a committee. And the committee redesigned the presidency. They gave the president a 4-year term, made him re-electable, elected by the people through an electoral college. a last minute change, and what a huge change it was. You know, they finally made that leap of faith to a truly independent executive because they trusted George Washington so much. All right, so there's 5 compromises. Now, everybody knows who wrote the Declaration of Independence, but not as many people, it seems, know who wrote the Constitution. And so who's the guy at the end who put pen to paper and actually wrote this thing? Very good. A Pennsylvanian named Gouverneur Morris. And Gouverneur Morris, he was quite a character. He had a wooden leg because he lost his leg in a carriage accident here in Philadelphia on Dock Street. And he was quite the womanizer. Now, when Morris lost his leg in the carriage accident, a friend of his, John Jay of New York, wrote a letter, and this is true. John Jay wrote, you know, it would have been better if Gouverneur Morris lost something else in the carriage accident. On September 17th, after 3.5 months, all but 3 of the delegates signed the completed Constitution, and the convention adjourned. There were 3 non-signers, men who were there the last day, but refused to sign. All of them were afraid that the Constitution would either lead to monarchy or aristocracy. And so the non-signers, George Mason of Virginia, Edmund Randolph of Virginia, and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. As the delegates were signing the completed Constitution, Ben Franklin pointed to the back of George Washington's chair. And Franklin said, when artists do their work, they have a hard time distinguishing a rising sun from a setting sun. You know, how do you say paint a rising sun versus a setting sun? And so Franklin says, I've been staring at this sun carved into George Washington's chair all summer long, trying to figure out, is this a rising sun or a setting sun? Now I know it's a rising sun. As Franklin headed home from the convention on the last day, he was stopped in the street by this lady, Elizabeth Powell, wife of Philadelphia's mayor. And Elizabeth Powell said, well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy? And Franklin replied, well, my dear, we have a republic if you can keep it. A republic if you can keep it. The founders launched an experiment in republican government, the only one on earth in a world of monarchy and kings. It was going to be a struggle to make this experiment work, and that was the duty of the American people. And I don't think it really becomes clear that the experiment is a success until perhaps the end of the Civil War, when finally it does become clear that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. One more story and I'm done. On September 15th, 1787, which is not the last day of the convention, but just about, the city of Philadelphia held a dinner in honor of George Washington at the City Tavern on 2nd Street. This is a modern reproduction of the original City Tavern. Let me share with you the final bill for that evening. Dinners for 55 gentlemen. The cost, £20 sterling. 54 bottles of Madeira, £20. 60 bottles of claret, £21. 8 bottles old stock, £3. 22 bottles of porter, £2. 8 bottles of cider, £1. 12 bottles of beer, £1. 7 large bowls of punch, £4. Cigars, £2. Wine glasses broken, £1. Dinners for 16 musicians, £2. 16 bottles of claret for musicians, £5. 5 bottles of Madeira for musicians, £1. And 7 bowls of punch for musicians, £2. The grand total cost, £89. This is 3 bottles of alcohol per person, plus the punch. And £89, obviously a lot of money. That converts into something like $15,000 in today's dollars. So, you know, these guys, they knew how to reward themselves for a job well done. Now, I mentioned the musicians. Let me read their names to you and see if you can figure out who these guys are. George Christliff, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Treninger, John Kaiser, William Hartung, Philip Rotti, David Kartzrock, John Bruner, Konrad Spangenberg. Who are these guys? They're Germans, right? They're Germans. Keep going. How might they have gotten here? Somebody said it? Hessians. They were Hessian mercenaries from the Hesse district in Germany. They were hired by the British to come over here and fight during the Revolutionary War on the British side. George Washington captured 900 of them in the Battle of Trenton. And then Washington offered his German prisoners amnesty. Become American citizens. And many of them did. And many settled in the Germantown section of Philadelphia, which is where my school, Salle University, is today. But isn't that a wonderful American immigration story? You know, these guys are coerced into coming here to fight George Washington. He captures them. They become Americans, and they end up playing their instruments in honor of George Washington at the Constitutional Convention. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. We so appreciate you coming and hanging out with us on Constitution Day, 235 years of We the People. That's what we're celebrating today. Hope you enjoyed Dr. Leibiger's talk. We do host these events throughout the year, so please, please, please tune in. Join us at constitutioncenter.org to find all of our upcoming events. We appreciate you celebrating with us today, and we hope to see you very soon at another virtual program. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.